Jacinda Ardern.
I'm very pleased to hear from the Senior Whip that the government's in a good space. But I have to say, I felt like that was somewhat a patronising contribution from that speaker, which is a shame, actually, because I don't think that those Kiwis who are out there watching the debate in the House today necessarily did tune in to hear the Senior Whip tell them what they would and wouldn't understand of the Green Party's contribution. I think they're perfectly entitled to raise issues in whatever language they choose, and people will judge that on its merits, as they will your speech, his speech. Thank you, Mr Speaker, for the opportunity to talk briefly on the Malaysia Free Trade Agreement Amendment Bill in the second reading. Obviously, Labor supports this bill because it was under the good work and steerage of Jim Sutton and the Honourable Phil Goff, who saw the majority of this agreement fall into place. And I think that demonstrates as well that some of these negotiations did start as early as 2005, and now we're looking at supporting the changes in these measures which will allow the Malaysia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement to be ratified. The deal, just to give a bit of background, and I think it's probably already been mentioned by some of my colleagues, but this deal expands on the Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement signed in February 2009 and essentially cuts the trade barriers between Malaysia and New Zealand to a swifter degree and to a greater extent. But I do want to talk a little bit in greater detail about the issue of an export-led recovery, because it's something that we've heard a lot about from the government and is relevant to this debate, because in all of these debates we hear the upsides and the downsides of free trade agreements, and I want to talk about the merits of the government talking solely about export-led recoveries without talking about some of the framework which exporters are working within, because I do believe that's relevant. I think it was on the 8th of September in 2009 that Bill English says we're looking for how to make sure we get a sustainable export-led recovery. This agreement, in my view, is only part of a solution in that regard. Sadly, the national government has really failed to look beyond free trade agreements at other measures to assist New Zealand exporters. For instance, and probably the most important measure I want to speak to is their refusal to even consider examining monetary policy, which will, I think, limit the extent to which new potential exporters will enter into the fray. John Key and Bill English have before both said that they think we have the best monetary policy in the world, but I think if they took the time to speak with struggling exporters who see their gains wiped out by a very volatile exchange rate, I think they would see the issue a little differently. And indeed, so does Labor. For those with an interest in this issue, I really would recommend looking at the speech that the Honourable David Parker made on this issue recently, but also the one made earlier in this year by Phil Goff, when he said, and this was quite a historic move on our part, that the consensus over monetary policy was over, and for good reason. We have a relatively low level of exporters in New Zealand comparative to the number of industries and entrepreneurs that we have in this country, and it's time we start asking questions about that. National's closed mind on monetary policy, though, has not only been challenged by Labor, it's been challenged by the IMF, who I always do quote with a few disclaimers, but they recently issued a report that said inflation targeting is necessary but not a sufficient tool for economic stability. And if indeed the national government's sole focus was economic stability through controlled inflation, you'd think they may have taken some of that into consideration. We're looking at the forecasting Treasury delivered to them over what would be generated via their latest budget, which will of course look to set us at some of the highest levels of inflation we've seen in some time, 5.9% from memory, which will have a significant impact on many New Zealand householders. But that, of course, is an ongoing debate. The IMF actually advocated additional use of monetary tools, so the exchange rate targeting or limiting the amount banks can lend against the value of property. They all suggest, I think, that there are other tools available, and perhaps we should be looking more broadly at some of those. But I think there's another really important point. I really look forward to hearing hearing Paul Quinn's contribution on this debate. He obviously wants to give the House a diatribe on his view of economics. But before he does that, I want to just talk briefly as well about I guess the foundations that need to be laid at the same time as an FTA agreement is signed, because I don't think it's just a matter of the government facilitating these kinds of agreements and then stepping back. In fact, I think the agreement with China was a very good example of how we could aid our exporters to really enter into a massive and difficult market with success. And we did that in 2008 by running a nationwide China roadshow, also launching a government website with information on the FTA and assistance on doing business in China. And I do think that was an incredibly important move to assisting our exporters in that regard. And when we are such a small market, I think it does take government to invest in some of those measures. But what is National doing to help New Zealand businesses make the most of opportunities in Malaysia? Well, I guess one of the best indicators we have is what measures are being put into the budget. And I have to say, not only very little, but actually the government is scaling back in this regard. In the 2009 budget, National, for instance, cut funding to New Zealand Trade and Enterprise by 101 million over the next 4 years. And I think, again, that's another example where a cut in investment in the long term will lead to a reduction in New Zealand's potential growth. So it's a short-term band-aid fix, which actually, I think, sets us back for very minimal savings. But also there have been budget cuts to New Zealand's Overseas Market Development Fund. And that stands in direct contrast to what was quite a considerable investment by Labor in this area. In fact, in its last term, the Labor government increased NZTE's funding for market development assistance from 6 million to 54 million, again in recognition that collectively investment in this area would reap even greater gains. But investment in this area is one thing. What's also incredibly important is making sure that New Zealand has an appropriate brand to trade on. We do have several significant exporters who can, of course, trade off their name. Zespri is one of them, and one of Zespri's successes, though, has been the fact that it's been able to trade as a single export desk. It doesn't have a multiple range of exporters all marketing different brands of kiwi fruit, for instance, and that is something we have to keep an eye on. It is something that is under threat. In the same way, New Zealand's brand becomes a brand across a whole range of products. They capitalise and trade off our brand because they in and of themselves may not be significant enough to trade solely on their own, which means brand protection around New Zealand is incredibly important. And not only has the national government, I think, depleted some of its investment in the marketing on behalf of our exporters, it's also done some damage to New Zealand's brand. I reflect briefly on the 3 issues in which New Zealand has made national headlines. I'll make that 4. The All Whites, that may have been some redemption in that regard. That one I'm proud of. The All Whites have got us to international headlines. The second most recent one, the Prime Minister's vasectomy. Not something I personally wish my country to be known for, but that made international headlines on the world stage. Secondly, the lack of respect that the Prime Minister showed by making cannibalism jokes at an inappropriate time. Again, not something that I wish my country to be known for. And then finally, the proposals from the government to mine parts of New Zealand's most precious conservation estate. Again, that was something noted in The Economist and The Guardian as undermining our brand. These things do not help the New Zealand brand. They do not, as a consequence, help our exporters. They don't help, I think, any of us as individual citizens who might be proud of our record and of our reputation. And I would like to extend a challenge to the national government that it isn't just about signing free trade agreements, it's about supporting our exporters, making sure the appropriate statutory framework is in place for them to be a success. That means reviewing our monetary policy. It's also about our brand.
Cam Calder, Doctor.
It's a pleasure to rise and speak briefly on this, the second reading.